There is a move happening in plain sight that virtually no Western financial analyst is willing to name clearly. India, America's designated strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific, the democracy that Washington has spent a decade cultivating as the counterweight to Chinese regional dominance, the country that received $4. $1 billion in American defense equipment in 2024 alone has begun systematically dismantling its dollar dependency. Not rhetorically, not in diplomatic speeches that mean nothing. Structurally, institutionally, in ways that, once completed, cannot be reversed without dismantling the alternative architecture being constructed to replace it. The number that frames this entire story is $2, $3 trillion. That is the combined value of the dollar-denominated trade, debt, and reserve assets that India is in the process of routing through alternative settlement frameworks over a timeline that Indian Finance Ministry documents obtained and analyzed by Reuters in April 2025. Project will reach structural completion by 2027. $2.3 trillion is not a marginal portfolio adjustment. It is not a symbolic gesture toward BRICS solidarity. It is the largest deliberate de-dollarization by a nominally Western-aligned economy in the history of the modern financial system. And the reason India is doing it, the actual reason, as opposed to the diplomatic language India's government deploys to avoid confrontation with Washington, reveals something fundamental about the structural limits of American financial power in the 21st century. India's dollar departure is not a single decision. It is an accumulation of at least 14 separate policy moves across 4 distinct domains: trade settlement, debt denomination, reserve composition, and payment infrastructure, each of which is individually defensible and collectively constitutes a systematic restructuring of Indian economic exposure to dollar-denominated systems. The trade settlement shift is the most visible. India has negotiated rupee-denomination trade settlement arrangements with 18 countries as of May 2025, according to Reserve Bank of India data. The most significant are with Russia, covering approximately $61. $4 billion in annual bilateral trade, primarily Russian energy imports and Indian pharmaceutical exports, and with the UAE covering approximately $84. $7 billion in annual trade that previously settled almost entirely in dollars. The UAE arrangement is particularly significant because it was not driven by sanctions avoidance or political alignment with Russian positions. It was driven by pure financial efficiency, the elimination of dollar conversion costs on trade between two countries whose currencies are both sufficiently stable to make bilateral settlement economically attractive. When the world's largest oil-producing emirate and the world's 5th largest economy find it economically rational to remove the dollar from their bilateral trade settlement, it signals something important about the dollar's value added in trade intermediation. The debt denomination shift is less visible, but structurally more consequential. India's sovereign borrowing has been exclusively rupee-denominated in domestic markets for decades. India does not issue dollar-denominated sovereign bonds, a policy maintained consistently since the 1991 balance of payments crisis. But Indian corporate borrowers have historically accessed international dollar credit markets extensively. The Reserve Bank of India data for Q1 2025 shows Indian corporate external commercial borrowing in rupees and alternative currencies reaching 34% of total external borrowing, up from 8% in 2020 and accelerating in trajectory. The reserve composition shift is precisely tracked. The Reserve Bank of India's annual report for 2024 to 2025 shows dollar-denominated assets falling to 2% of total foreign exchange reserves, down from 4% in 2019. The shift has been gradual, deliberate, and executed without drama or announcement. The freed allocation has moved primarily into gold, which now represents 9%. 1% of Indian reserves and into a diversified basket of currency positions, including euros, yen, and a growing allocation to yuan-denominated instruments that the RBI categorizes in a manner that obscures the specific size. The payment infrastructure shift is the piece that receives the least English language coverage and is strategically the most important. India's UPI, Unified Payments Interface, is now the world's largest real-time retail payment system by transaction volume, processing approximately $2 trillion in domestic transactions annually. The international expansion of UPI, which India has been negotiating with Singapore, France, UAE, Mauritius, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and 8 other countries, represents the construction of a transaction infrastructure that is explicitly designed to function without dollar intermediation. These 4 shifts are not coordinated in the sense of being directed by a single strategic plan. They are coordinated in the deeper sense of responding to the same set of underlying incentives that the American financial policy decisions of 2022 and 2023 altered in ways that made dollar dependency more costly and dollar alternatives more attractive for Indian planners. To understand why India is moving now with this velocity and at this scale, it is necessary to understand what Indian financial policymakers took from the events of February and March 2022, and why those lessons were different from the lessons that Western financial analysts assumed they would take. When the United States, European Union, and allied nations froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves in March 2022, the stated objective was to impose maximum economic pressure on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. From a Western perspective, the action demonstrated the power of dollar-denominated financial infrastructure as a foreign policy instrument. From the perspective of the Reserve Bank of India's Foreign Exchange Reserve Management Team, the action demonstrated something different and considerably more alarming. It demonstrated that dollar reserve holdings maintained in Western custody, whether at the Federal Reserve, the Bank for International Settlements, or custodial arrangements with European central banks, are subject to confiscation by Western political decisions that the Indian government has no ability to influence or veto. India held approximately $580 billion in foreign exchange reserves in March 2022, of which approximately $390 billion was dollar-denominated and held in Western custody arrangements. The events of March 2022 demonstrated that $390 billion in Indian national wealth was, in a technical legal sense, subject to the same confiscation authority that had been applied to Russian reserves. Not because India was at risk of such action, Mapper says Nakusains American officials were careful to communicate privately that India's reserves were not at risk. But because the legal and institutional machinery for such an action existed, had been demonstrated to work, and could be activated by political decisions that the Indian government had no formal standing to contest. The private American assurances were heard and noted. They were also understood in New Delhi for what they were: expressions of current political intention, not structural modifications to the legal framework. Current political intentions change. Legal frameworks persist until deliberately altered. The Reserve Bank of India's subsequent reserve diversification, documented in the annual reports that followed, was not a hostile act toward the United States. It was a rational risk management response by professionals whose fiduciary responsibility is to protect Indian national wealth from all identified risks, including the risk of Western political decisions affecting dollar reserve holdings. But the risk management logic does not stop at reserve diversification. If the dollar system carries political risk for reserve assets, it carries related political risk for trade settlement, for debt denomination, and for payment infrastructure. The logical extension of the 2022 risk assessment is the four-domain restructuring now visibly underway. This is the mechanism that explains the timing. Not anti-American political alignment, not BRICS ideological solidarity. Risk-adjusted financial rationality applied by professional reserve managers to a risk that the events of 2022 made undeniable. The $2. 3 trillion figure requires precise unpacking because it is not a single balance that India is moving. It is the projected cumulative value of transactions, reserves, and financial exposures that Indian Finance Ministry models project will be routed through non-dollar frameworks by 2027 compared to 2022 baseline dollar routing. The Reuters analysis of Indian Finance Ministry documents breaks this down into 4 components. First, cumulative trade settlement value through non-dollar frameworks between 2022 and 2027, approximately $890 billion. This includes the Russian energy trade, projected $305 billion over 5 years at current volumes. The UAE bilateral settlement arrangement, projected $425 billion, and the remaining 16 country arrangements, collectively projected at $160 billion. This component is the most visible because it appears in trade statistics. Second, incremental Indian corporate external borrowing in non-dollar denominations versus dollar baseline, approximately $340 billion. This is the value of corporate credit that would have been dollar-denominated under 2020 behavioral patterns, but is now being accessed in rupees, euros, or alternative currency frameworks. This component has no single visible data point, but emerges from aggregating Reserve Bank of India external commercial borrowing data. Third, reserve composition shift from dollar to alternative assets relative to 2022 baseline, approximately $420 billion. This represents the cumulative reallocation of Indian reserve assets away from dollar-denominated instruments, the gold purchases, the alternative currency positions, and the unnamed yuan-denominated allocations, measured against what the 2022 reserve composition trajectory would have produced if maintained. Fourth, and most speculatively, but also most significantly for long-term trajectory, the projected transaction value that will be routed through the UPI international infrastructure rather than dollar clearing systems once the international UPI expansion reaches operational scale by 2026 to 2027. Finance Ministry models estimate this at approximately $650 billion annually by 2027, but the Reuters analysis discounts this figure substantially given implementation uncertainty, arriving at a 5-year present value contribution to the $2. 3 trillion total of approximately $650 billion. The precision of these figures should not be mistaken for certainty. They are projections, not actualized numbers, and they involve modeling assumptions that reasonable analysts contest. What is not contestable is the directional commitment they represent. Indian policy is systematically reducing dollar dependency across every domain in which that dependency can be measured, at a pace that will make the restructuring structurally complete within the current decade. Here is the piece of the analysis that creates the most discomfort for American strategic planners, and it deserves direct address. India is not abandoning the American strategic relationship. Simultaneously, with its dollar departure, India is deepening security cooperation with the United States, expanding the Quad framework, signing additional defense technology transfer agreements, increasing joint military exercises, and positioning itself as the primary American partner in the Indian Ocean region. The ICET Technology Partnership Agreement, signed in 2023, expanded in 2024 to include advanced semiconductor cooperation, AI research collaboration, and space technology development worth approximately $8 billion in bilateral investment. These two tracks, deepening security alignment with Washington and systematic dollar departure, appear contradictory. They are not. They reflect a strategic posture that Indian foreign policy has practiced since the non-aligned movement of the 1950s, extracting maximum value from relationships with competing great powers without submitting to the dependency conditions that those relationships typically impose. India is taking American security guarantees, defense technology, and market access, all of which serve genuine Indian national interests. India is simultaneously reducing its exposure to American financial leverage, the ability to use dollar system access as a coercive instrument in future bilateral disputes over trade policy, technology transfer, or geopolitical alignment. The calculation is sophisticated and, from the Indian perspective, rational. The security relationship is valuable, and India has demonstrated it is a reliable partner. But the financial leverage relationship creates a dependency that constrains Indian foreign policy autonomy in ways that the post-2022 risk assessment has made unacceptable. Consider what dollar dependency actually means as a constraint. India's trade with Russia, which generates significant economic value for India, particularly through discounted energy imports that save Indian consumers approximately $12 to $18 billion annually compared to market rate alternatives, is a constant source of American diplomatic pressure. American officials have repeatedly communicated that Indian financial institutions could face secondary sanctions consequences for facilitating substantial Russian energy payments. If those payments route through dollar clearing systems, the American threat is credible and immediately actionable. If those payments route through the bilateral rupee-ruble settlement framework that India and Russia have been constructing, American leverage over those specific transactions is substantially reduced. The energy savings persist. The American secondary sanctions threat loses its operative mechanism. This is not India defying the United States. This is India removing the infrastructure through which specific forms of American financial coercion operate, while maintaining the security relationship that gives India confidence to proceed. India is keeping what it values in the American relationship and eliminating what constrains it. At this point in the analysis, it is worth pausing on the pattern that has now emerged across three separate analytical threads: the Russia normalization framework, the European semiconductor dispute, and now the Indian dollar departure. In each case, Chinese strategic interests are served by developments that Beijing did not engineer and in many cases explicitly distanced itself from publicly. India's de-dollarization does not route Indian financial flows primarily toward yuan-denominated systems. Indian policymakers have been careful to avoid the appearance of yuan adoption, which would create domestic political liabilities and generate American diplomatic responses that would complicate the security relationship India values. The explicit goal is rupee settlement and reserve diversification toward golden baskets, not yuan dependency. But the structural effect of Indian de-dollarization on the dollar system is identical regardless of whether the departing assets move toward yuan or toward rupees or toward gold. Every dollar of Indian trade that routes through non-dollar settlement, every dollar of Indian reserves that moves from dollar assets to alternative holdings reduces the aggregate global demand for dollar-denominated instruments that supports the dollar system's foundational functioning. The dollar's reserve currency status rests on a self-reinforcing cycle. Global demand for dollars to settle trade creates demand for dollar assets, which funds American deficits, which supports American financial stability, which sustains confidence in the dollar, which maintains global demand for dollars to settle trade. The cycle is remarkably robust. It has persisted through multiple shocks over 75 years. But it is not infinite. The marginal erosion of each component of that cycle creates cumulative pressure on all others. Indian de-dollarization on $2. $3 trillion in projected exposure is not by itself sufficient to break the cycle. The dollar system is too large, approximately $26 trillion in global foreign exchange reserves, and dollar-denominated assets representing approximately $90 trillion globally, for any single country's reallocation to be systemically decisive. What Indian de-dollarization contributes is acceleration of a trend. Combined with Russian de-dollarization, Gulf state bilateral settlement experiments, African local currency frameworks, and the gradual but documented decline in dollar reserve share, Indian policy adds momentum to a trajectory that the IMF data already shows in progress. And momentum in financial systems matters. The dollar's reserve currency premium, the ability of the United States to finance deficits at artificially low interest rates because global demand for dollar assets exceeds pure economic fundamentals, is estimated by Federal Reserve economists at approximately $50 to $100 billion annually in reduced borrowing costs. As reserve share declines, that premium erodes. As the premium erodes, American debt service costs rise. As debt service costs rise, American fiscal space for both domestic programs and international commitments narrows. China benefits from this trajectory without directing it, without funding it, and without taking diplomatic responsibility for it. The benefit accrues automatically through the mechanical logic of financial system dynamics. The decline of British pound sterling as a global reserve currency is the closest historical template for what the dollar may be experiencing. And the mechanism of that decline is more instructive than the endpoint. In 1914, the pound sterling was the undisputed foundation of global trade finance. Approximately 60% of global trade was invoiced in sterling, and British financial institutions intermediated the majority of international capital flows. The British pound was not merely a currency. It was the architecture of global commerce. Between 1914 and 1976, when Britain accepted an IMF bailout that formally ended the pound's reserve currency pretensions, the sterling's share of global reserves fell from approximately 60% to under 3%. But the decline was not linear, and it was not driven primarily by British economic weakness. The periods of sharpest decline followed specific events that demonstrated sterling's vulnerability. The 1931 suspension of the gold standard, the 1944 Bretton Woods arrangements that formally established dollar primacy, the 1956 Suez Crisis that exposed British financial dependence on American goodwill. Each event did not cause the decline by itself. Each event demonstrated a structural vulnerability that had been accumulating, and the demonstration accelerated behavioral changes by reserve managers and trade financiers who incorporated the new information into their risk frameworks. The parallel to the dollar is not that any single current event, Russian sanctions, Indian de-dollarization, Chinese yuan expansion, is decisive. The parallel is that each event demonstrates a vulnerability, and each demonstration accelerates the behavioral adjustments that cumulatively erode the structural foundations of reserve currency status. Indian de-dollarization demonstrates two vulnerabilities simultaneously. First, that the dollar's premium is sufficiently eroded that the world's fifth largest economy finds it economically rational to pay the transition costs of developing alternative infrastructure. Second, that American security relationships do not prevent strategic partners from taking systematic steps to reduce American financial leverage, meaning the American security umbrella no longer serves as a binding constraint on dollar alternatives. The second demonstration is the more important one. For decades, American analysts have argued that dollar reserve status was structurally secured by the fact that the countries that might otherwise abandon it were dependent on American security guarantees that constrained their behavior. The Indian case challenges this assumption directly. India is deepening its security relationship while simultaneously reducing its financial dependency. The two dimensions of the relationship can be disaggregated. And if they can be disaggregated by India, they can be disaggregated by other American security partners as well. That is the precedent that Indian de-dollarization sets. Not the specific dollar amount, the demonstration that the bundling of security and financial dependency that underwrote dollar stability for decades is coming apart. The $2. 3 trillion figure represents Indian exposure in motion, financial flows and holdings being systematically restructured away from dollar dependency. It does not trap India. India is executing the restructuring deliberately at a pace it controls, and the economic logic of the move favors Indian interests at every step. The trap is for the dollar system, and it operates through the mechanism of irreversibility. Every bilateral trade settlement arrangement that India operationalizes creates institutional infrastructure, payment systems, clearing relationships, legal frameworks, corporate treasury procedures that is costly to reverse once embedded. Every rupee-denominated bond issue that Indian corporations execute demonstrates to their finance teams that non-dollar external borrowing is feasible, reducing the perceived friction of future non-dollar transactions. Every Reserve Bank of India gold purchase represents a permanent transfer of dollar-denominated assets to gold holdings that will not spontaneously return to dollar accounts. The restructuring, once complete, does not reverse when political winds shift. It is structural, it is institutional. It reflects private sector behavioral adaptations that aggregate across millions of business decisions. No single policy change reverses it, and the timeline matters enormously. Indian Finance Ministry projections suggest structural completion by 2027 within the current American political cycle. This means that whatever diplomatic or economic inducements American policymakers might offer to slow or reverse Indian de-dollarization, they face an opposition of self-reinforcing institutional momentum that grows stronger with each quarter of continued implementation. The American dollar system faces a challenge that is not primarily military, not primarily diplomatic, and not primarily ideological. It is financial and institutional, driven by the rational risk management decisions of professional reserve managers, corporate treasurers, and government finance officials in countries that value American security partnerships, but have concluded that dollar financial dependency is no longer a necessary component of those partnerships. $2.3 trillion in Indian financial exposure is departing the dollar system. It is not sudden. It did not begin suddenly, but the acceleration that the data shows in rupee trade settlement volumes, in reserve composition shifts, in corporate external borrowing patterns, in UPI international expansion is happening now at a pace that was not projected 3 years ago. The question worth asking, as an analyst or as a professional whose livelihood intersects with the dollar-based financial architecture, is not whether this is happening. The data says it is. The question is what the world looks like in 2030 when the structural completion that Indian planners have projected arrives on schedule. And the answer to that question is not yet written.